Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to welcome you here again. Today we run a joint seminar organized by Russian International Affairs Council and Valdai Discussion Club. Today we are focused on a recent Valdai paper, which is concentrated on Marxism in post-globalization era. And we have a number of prominent guests here. I must say that these seminars are becoming a good tradition of our partnership between RIAC and Valdai. And I hope that today we will have a fruitful and vibrant discussion. Because in my view, the Marxist paradigm, as well as the problems addressed by Marxism and the way they are addressed, are significantly underestimated in the global academic and public discourse. So I think that today we will be able to fill in this gap, at least partly, and have an interesting discussion. I pass the floor to Fyodor Lukyanov, who is Director for Science and Research of Valdai Discussion Club, for his introductory remarks.
Thank you very much. The remarks will be very short. First of all, before the start, we had a very interesting conversation with one of our speakers today, Ivan Ayala from Podemos, and we just discovered that Podemos does not identify itself as a Marxist movement, so it will be extremely interesting to discuss not only Marxism, which is described in a really excellent paper of Boris Kagarlitsky, published recently by Valdai, but also all other incarnations of left-wing thinking in today's world. I just want to say that for Valdai Club, last year we launched a scientific academic program, and all of us decided that one of sub-programs should be absolutely about, so to say, alternative ways to assess international relations and international situation, because we feel that discussion both in Russia and worldwide is a little bit simplified, especially now in the situation of a big political crisis. And we need fresh thinking. Not necessarily all of alternative thoughts are applicable to the practical politics, but at least to enrich debate and to achieve a new quality of intellectual quality was one of our tasks, and we hope that this program, which will continue all this year and partly at least will be reflected in the big Valdai meeting in October, will help us to find new approaches to very, very difficult challenges we are facing. And the chair, the leader of this program at the Valdai Club is Professor Oleg Barabanov from GIMO, so I pass the floor to him.
Thank you, Fyodor. Thank you, Ivan. Exactly, we now started a very interesting and very unusual program for the Valdai Club because previously, for all 20 years after the independence of Russia and the collapse of the Soviet Union, the main political partners of the Russian political parties, of the Russian political elites, and the Kremlin in the general sense of this word, were the mainstream parties in the West. Were Christian Democrats, were Social Democrats, were right-center parties, and at the same time we had very few, if any, culture of dialogue with left-wing and right-wing parties, who promoted alternatives to the liberal mainstream view. And now, surprisingly, and maybe not surprisingly, after the start of Ukrainian crisis and after the break of all previous everyday relations of Russian political parties with their mainstream vis-a-vis in Europe, there were only alternative parties, or only left-wing parties, Marxist and progressist parties of the left wing in Europe, and also right-wing parties in Europe, who continued to discuss the situation with Russia. Some of them promoted the idea, the deeper cooperation with Russia in this situation after the Ukrainian crisis. So Russia received, very surprisingly, for herself, the new allies, the new political allies from both the radical right wing and rather radical left wing in Europe. And now, still, I repeat that we are lacking the culture of dialogue. If we are talking about, for example, with SYRIZA from Greece, and there was a visit of the Greek Prime Minister Tsipras to Moscow a couple of months ago. And if, let's imagine, the Podemos will win at the forthcoming Spanish parliamentary election, and there will be the Podemos government in Spain. So what would be the reason, what would be the logic for bilateral discussions of Russia with these parties, with these left-wing governments? Not only about sanctions on Russia, not only oil and gas as we usually did, but I think that we should now in Russia, to be prepared to use some left-wing ideology, to use some left-wing rhetorics in good sense of the word, to be a reliable partner for these new allies, for these new partners from the left-wing European spectrum. Because unfortunately or fortunately, with the break of all ties with the liberal mainstream in the European Union, these gentlemen or these comrades are the only partners of Russia now. We can want it or we can not want it, but that's the reality. So one of the ideas of the Valdai program, the Global Alternatives, is exactly to promote this culture of dialogue with a new left and new progressist parties in Europe. And that is why we decided to organize this webinar, inviting three prominent speakers. The first speaker is Dr. Boris Kagarlitsky, the prominent Russian expert on Marxism, on left social movements, the director of Institute of Globalization and Social Movement, and the author of a recently published Valdai analytic paper on the global role of Marxism today. But also, as we can see, the left ideology, the new left ideology, can go simply beyond Marxism, and that is maybe the case of Podemos movement in Spain, and that is why we are glad to invite here Dr. Ivana Yala, who is one of the economic experts of the Podemos, who I hope will explain us how this movement was growing, how its economic and political program was developing, and so on. And we also, I'm glad to present Mr. Renfrey Clark, the long-term left-wing journalist here in Russia, who was representing various green and left journals, and also Mr. Clark is the green left activist in Australia. So this will be our speakers, and also I invite all the people from both offline table and online from the web to raise their questions and discussions. And now I give the floor to Boris Kagarlitsky.
Thank you very much, Oleg, and Fyodor and Ivan. I have to thank you very much for being able to be here to speak about these issues. And of course, it is a great opportunity to be able to write this paper for Valdai Club, because it was also an opportunity for myself to put together some of my own ideas. So I'm very thankful that at some point Oleg just came to me and said, "Why don't you write a paper about that?" I said, "Why not? It's a way to summarize something which I'm thinking about anyhow." But first I want to point to something which I shouldn't say it's a disagreement, but it's just something which has to be noticed, that when we're speaking about Marxism, we are not speaking about ideology. Of course, when we're speaking about Marxism as an ideology, that is a very limited question, mainly about a few communist parties, surviving communist parties, which are stressing that they are parties of Marxist ideology. And even there, we can have a few debates about what do they understand as Marxist ideology. But in this sense, Marxism is something which is much more than ideology. Because it's a school of thought, it's a method of analysis, and it's a worldview. So in that sense, actually for a party to be politically important and to change social and political relations and economic relations in a society, I don't think it is necessary to be Marxist in terms of proclaiming any kind of official ideology of the party. And even more, I think in many ways it would be counterproductive to see Marxism just as a kind of party ideology, which will limit our opportunities and our potential, just I have to turn it off, our potential of using this very Marxist methods and ideas and traditions, and intellectual traditions and political traditions. So in that sense, the very moment when we start talking about Marxist ideology, we actually limit the spectrum of thought and the spectrum of action even within which we are capable of working. In that sense, the important thing about Marxism is to use specific methods which were developed, of course, by Karl Marx, but also by quite a few politicians, sociologists, economists since Karl Marx and up to now, but also is to try to respond to a set of particular questions which are central for the Marxist approach to reality. And then let's come to the paper itself. What was and what is in the paper? What I was trying to say when I was writing it. First, why is it called post-globalization? For a few years already, I mean, not just myself, but a few colleagues around me are playing with this term. And even we had a project which continued for about a year and a half, an international project with a few radical left-wing experts in the West, not just in the West, in India as well, and in South Africa, which was called Post-Globalization Initiative. Why is it post-globalization? For two reasons. On the one hand, we see the end of an era. The current crisis, what's happening around us now, it is definitely telling us that the era of neoliberal globalization is coming to its end. And by the way, in my book, From Empires to Imperialism, I tried to show that actually the whole history of capitalism is shaped through periods of globalizations and deglobalizations. So in that sense, it's basically very much within the same intellectual trajectory as Emil Wallerstein is developing. I think I made one more step further, just trying to saw that as a series of changes within the capitalist system, which are very logical, that there are phases through which capitalism goes globally, internationally. But it was Emil Wallerstein who made this very important point. He said capitalism first emerged as a global system, and only then, later, national capitalisms emerged as a consequence of the development of the global system. So in that sense, why post-globalization? Basically, because the era of neoliberal globalization seems to come to its end, but it doesn't mean that we are just coming back to the kind of world which existed before it, to the world of the 1970s, for example, the 1960s. No matter how we can be nostalgic about this world, not just in the Soviet past, in the case of Soviet past, when quite a lot of people are nostalgic here for the Soviet past, but I should tell you quite a lot of people in the West are nostalgic for the welfare state, for the social democratic welfare state of the 1960s, the golden age of the welfare state. So, like it or not, we just can't turn the clock back, we just can't go there. So in that sense, it's not just deglobalization, as my friend Walton Bellow uses to say, but it is post-globalization. So we have to go beyond that experience. But then we're coming to the second question, what is next? And this is exactly the big question. As Americans say, it's $100 question. I think it's more than $100 question. It's maybe a few $billion question. But anyhow, literally. but here is the question to which we do not have an answer yet. And then everybody is saying, okay, look, everybody is dissatisfied with the current state of the world, but where's the alternative? There is no alternative. And by the way, interestingly enough, if you follow the debate in the West, and partly in Russia as well, but mostly in the West, in about 2007, 2008, maybe early 2009, everybody was saying, okay, neoliberalism is not working, and maybe some kind of socialist measures are necessary. And a few socialist measures actually did take place, like there were a few nationalizations actually in the developed countries, including in Britain, for example. Where they had to nationalize one of the collapsing banks, and in the United States they also had to use some government intervention. Whether it was socialism, I mean, no, I don't think it was socialism, but anyhow, some measures which were taken from the socialist kind of tradition. But then what happened was not any kind of socialist anti-crisis policies being implemented, but rather even more of neoliberalism being implemented. So the period between 2009 and now was the period when neoliberalism continued and in many ways went to its extreme. So some of the measures which were considered to be too extreme in the period of stable growth, or growth which seemed to be stable, as we learned later, became possible. And if you're looking at a country like Spain or Greece and some other countries of Southern and even Western Europe, like Ireland, what we see there is a very radical attack on what remains of the welfare state. So it's not less neoliberalism, but rather more neoliberalism. And the answer to it is that so far nobody offered anything better or anything different, so all the elites just had to follow the recipes which were available at the moment. But here we're coming to the first big question, why was it so? And my answer is that you just cannot change policies for the only reason that they're wrong or they're not working. That is absolutely not enough. Even if everybody knows that the policy is not working, and even if everybody knows that the policy is wrong, it doesn't really matter. What matters is whether there is a collective subject, a collective political and social force, interested in changing these policies. If you don't have a subject, an actor, a collective actor, capable of providing an alternative and interested in something different, and interested consciously, not just in terms of having some hopes, but being capable of formulating these new alternatives, these new approaches, the policies will be implemented and they will continue, whether you like it or not, whether they're good or bad, whether they're right or wrong, it doesn't really matter, because there will be nothing else on the table. And there will be no force and no interest, no collective interest forcing these things to move elsewhere. And here we're coming exactly to the question, where is this force and who and what can become this force? And here exactly we're coming to the big questions of Marxism, because in classical Marxism what we see is the proletariat, which was in the old-style Marxist discourse identified with industrial workers, to be that collective force to present new agenda. And actually it did happen. It did happen in Russia in 1917, but it also did happen in the West, and it happened in the West in the form of social democratic welfare state, which was also very much imposed on the bourgeoisie, on the ruling elites, by organized collective proletariat, though not revolutionary proletariat, but a kind of reformist proletariat, social democratic reformist proletariat. But still there was a collective subject capable of developing some agenda. The problem is that that kind of subject is now both not existing and existing, but in a different form. And that created a big debate, because already since the late 20th century, some authors, starting with André Gortz, kept saying, well, proletariat is disappearing. It is disappearing. In the West, it is disappearing even as a global force, and so on. Partly because workers are getting wealthy in the West, they're getting some kind of level of income which doesn't make them proletariat anymore. It turns them into middle class, which I think is, as a scientific, as an academic argument, is totally wrong, because being proletarian doesn't mean that you have to be a pauper, that you have just nothing, no property, no income, and so on. What means being proletariat is that your relations to the relation to the forces of production is a specific one. You have to sell your labor force. So the other argument which was developed, including Immanuel Wallerstein, was totally opposite. Immanuel Wallerstein kept saying, look, it's exactly the other way around. There is a growing proletarization of the world, because if we are looking at the global system, not just at, say, France, Germany, or Italy, but if you're looking at the global world, the number of people on wage labor who are dependent on selling their workforce is growing. But there, Wallerstein made a very interesting and very important remark, on which I'm trying to develop my own argument. And the remark was that Wallerstein said, it's not that they're necessarily all becoming proletariat, but they're becoming proletarized, which is a very important difference. So in that sense, I think, first of all, the structure of wage labor, globally and nationally, is changing very dramatically. So there are now so many different ways of selling your labor force, your workforce, that you cannot imagine just one homogeneous working class the way it used to be, at least imagined by Marxist sociology, and the way it imagined itself through collective ideology and collective identity. So in that sense, you can have plenty of people who objectively are put into proletarized positions. But it doesn't mean that they are the same. It doesn't mean that they're homogeneous. They're heterogeneous. They're extremely heterogeneous, both within every single country and globally. In terms of the level of their wages, but also in terms of their interests. It's not only that some people get more money and others get less money. It's that their interests are not homogeneous either. So in that sense, it's a very heterogeneous mass of people. And the second point is that quite a lot of them are semi-proletarized. So they're dependent on selling their workforce, their labor force to capitalists, to the market, to the labor market, but they also sometimes have some other sources of income. Their relations with capital is very precarious. So, and they can be wage earners, but they sell their labor as small entrepreneurs. So they're selling themselves to the market, but they're not selling themselves as workers in the traditional industrial economy, but they're selling themselves to the market as private entrepreneurs who have nothing to sell but themselves, by the way they act on the labor market is not necessarily the traditional way workers used to act in the industrial society. And so on and so on. So I can go more and more into all these details about the heterogeneous and homogeneous kind of sides of the class phenomena. But what I'm saying is that we're coming here to the question of politics, because then the question of politics is how these heterogeneous masses can be brought together into something more consolidated. And by the way, here we can also get to some experience from the 19th century, because if we're looking at the 19th century workers again, at the very beginning, they also did not see themselves as just one single force. Like if you can take a locomotive driver and a miner and a servant selling his work to some individuals, and industrial workers and service workers and so on and so on. All these people did not initially see themselves as just one solid class group. So it needed a work of trade union organizers, socialist ideologues, Marxists, non-Marxist socialists, or social democrats, or anarchists, anybody, who just brought these people together, not only explaining to them that they are just one class, but also trying to formulate some kind of common interest of these people. So in that sense, ironically, we're back to this kind of work, trying to bring together different pieces, different fragments of what used to be the old proletariat, and which is now the new semi-proletariat or post-proletariat, whatever we call it, to bring together these pieces in order to try to develop a common interest. And not just tell people, well, they have to learn, I don't know, from Marxist texts and learn the right ideology. Like many people on the left would love them just to do that. Just you have to learn from us the right ideas, and once you learn these ideas, you're fine, right? No, it's very much about developing their own understanding of their own interests, but at the same time, coordinating and consolidating these interests, putting together these interests into a broader common interest. So this is an important work, and this work doesn't necessarily need traditional class politics of the 19th or 20th century. And it's very interesting that the new phenomena of the upcoming political forces like Podemos and SYRIZA is also very telling. These forces are in one way or another are populist. Because in Russia, journalists hate this word, or they love to use this word to attack somebody. He's a populist. I have no problem with this word, populist, because it means that you have to bring together broader popular interests, which are going beyond just specific interests. You're going to develop a broader agenda. So these are parties which are populist, so they bring together different social groups. They bring together different social groups, and they are heterogeneous ideologically, which is good, which is natural, which doesn't mean, though, that you don't have to do some kind of very serious work on homogenization. But this work cannot be done through just imposing the correct ideology on these people. It has to be done through the movement itself, through the process of learning, struggling, learning, practical changes, moving, acting. So it's a very complex dialectical process. And the second point is, coming from this first point, these are parties, movements. These are not traditional centralized parties, even though they sometimes try to become ones. Like if you're looking at SYRIZA, now we can follow a very interesting debate within SYRIZA that Tsipras and his entourage are accused of acting as Stalinists, because they're trying to centralize the party, to bring it together, to make it more governable, more kind of more controllable. So some of the people within their very party are saying these people are Stalinists, they're behaving the Stalinist way, and so on. Who's right and who's wrong, I'm not capable, and I'm not in the position of saying. I'm just pointing to the fact that on the one hand you have to move towards more kind of consolidated political force, because otherwise you're inefficient. You're going simply to lose if you're not capable of acting as one piece, as one force. On the other hand, however, of course, you have to preserve what became the source of your strength, which is exactly a broad coalition of forces and people and interests which brought you together. So if you're going too far and too fast in the centralization drive, you end up really badly. So this is the first question which I'm addressing in my paper, and just I have to notice one kind of side moment or self-comment here, which is that this new populist opposition is not only emerging from the left, it's also emerging from the right. And if you're looking at Front National in France, what we're discovering, interestingly, is not only that Front National, under Marine Le Pen, not under her father, Jean-Marie Le Pen, but under Marine Le Pen today, is not only collecting often the very same forces at the social level, which Podemos and SYRIZA are bringing together on the left, but ironically and interestingly enough, it is very often developing the same argument. And very often it is proposing some of the same changes which are proposed by the left in some other places. So this is a kind of challenge to which we have to respond. And by the way, I think so far the response of the left is not adequate, because the left keeps just blaming Front National as being a fascist and racist party, and people are just kind of thinking that that's just enough. You just label them as fascists and racists and forget about them. At the same time, if you're looking at the electoral record of Front National, what you discover is that the biggest new addition of votes which Front National is getting throughout the last 5 years comes from immigrants. Front National is now probably the biggest, or maybe one of the biggest the biggest force enjoying Arab and black vote in France. If you're looking at some parts of southern France, like in Marseille, you're looking at electoral geography of the city, and looking where Front National is getting majorities locally. These are the neighborhoods inhabited by the immigrants, not by the white French, who are voting for the pro-establishment parties. So in that sense, you cannot simply stop with just saying these are racist guys. No, they're not. Maybe they are, though, by the way, in deep in their hearts and in their minds, but they manage to develop an argument to attract immigrant and black vote, which tells you much. Why? By the way, it's very easy, because most immigrants compete with other immigrants. So that's why when you have an anti-immigration discourse, ideologically, it's one thing, but in terms of practical results, it's very often the discourse which is most attractive and most appealing for the immigrants which are already in the country, saying, well, we've got into the country and we'd rather prefer to close the door behind us, so not to have more competitors coming right after us to create problems. Or like if you're a Senegalese worker who managed to get a flat in Senegal, a flat in France, and then you know that there is a whole village which would love to come to live in your flat. So there will be another 20, 50, 70 relatives eager to join you in your small flat. So you'd rather say, French border police, why don't you just stop them? Because I can't avoid having them here once they come. But if there is a border police on the way, it will make my flat a bit safer. So, but anyhow, finishing with that, I think there is the other aspect of the current transformation to which I want address, and that will be the end of my presentation, but it is very important. The other type of debate, which was typical for Marxist discussions of the 1970s and up to very recently, was a debate about North-South relations. And there was this traditional concept of wealthy capitalists, developed, quote unquote, developed West and North, actually prospering because of exploiting and redistributing wealth from the South in its favor, which was in many ways correct. I absolutely agree that that phenomenon was there. But you have also to see that in the current period, the balance of forces is changing, and the structure of global world is also changing. So on the one hand, we have the famous BRICS phenomena with the rise of China, with a new role played by Brazil or India in the world. But also on the other hand, what we're seeing is, by the way, the decline of some countries of Southern Europe and even Western European countries like Ireland. So what we are having here is that it is very much a kind of market logic, by the way. If somebody is rising, somebody is growing, it's quite natural that somebody is losing out. So in that sense, it's not only the rise of the new powers, but it's also, unfortunately, in the situation of neoliberal competitive capitalism, this rise of China, for example, is accompanied by a decline of quite a few other countries. By the way, including some of the third world countries, which were also losing out to this kind of winners. So in that sense, it's not only that some Western countries are losing out, but some of the non-Western countries are also among the losers. So, but there is a huge redistribution of wealth and power, which also changes the global balance of forces, and which also undermines the current American hegemony, which was based on the previous balance of forces, and this balance of forces is not there anymore. But ironically, it doesn't make our world safer or more just. It's just is making our world less stable, because while the old hegemony is disintegrating or declining, or at least getting weaker, it doesn't mean that the new hegemony is coming. And by the way, it doesn't mean even that somebody is really challenging the hegemony. This is a very big difference, because somebody sees China as challenging American hegemony. I think it is not. Or rather, China is challenging American hegemony objectively. It's not that there is a conscious strategy of China to challenge American hegemony, but just the objective process, which is in many ways led by Chinese development or produced by Chinese development, even when China doesn't want it, objectively leads to the erosion of American hegemony. And this is something we have to deal with. And here the role of Russia is also very important, because it's the only European BRICS country, and the only BRICS country which is an old empire, historically. I'm not calling Russia an empire, I'm just saying that historically it's a country which used to be one of the European empires, like it or not, and which has this tradition. Again, whether we like it or not, we have it as part of our historic tradition. And there are good things about that, and there are bad things about that, but anyhow, it is here, and we have to deal with this question. And with this change in balance of forces and powers, I think we have to see that both as dangerous, but also as opening up quite a few opportunities. So why I put these 2 points together? Because I think the social side, socio-economic side, and geoeconomic side, rather, I hate geopolitics, I'd rather prefer geoeconomics, following again our great teacher Emmanuel Wallerstein. I think geoeconomically and socio-politically, we're bringing together 2 sets of challenges, but also 2 sets of opportunities. And in that sense, again, what is very important is to link up these 2 processes. The emergence of new collective social subject, which can become political, and which is already becoming political here or there, like in Greece and Spain, but only locally so far. Just in 2 countries we can see a very clear success story. Though there are some interesting things happening in Turkey, with the Democratic People's Party emerging, and the new party of the underclass emerging in India, and so on. But these are just particular specific local success stories, which are not yet coming to any kind of formation of global social and political subject, but it is in the process of emerging. And then we're seeing the same problem with the need for some kind of collective geo-economic and geopolitical alternative, the alternative which coming out of geoeconomics can become and should become geopolitics. So in that sense, again, I think for Russia, it's really a moment of change, but also a moment of truth, because I think Russia didn't want to get involved in this conflict with the West. It was very much like the West actually was, I should say attacking Russia, but at least was putting pressure on Russia, which forced Russian elites to resist, even against their own will, and sometimes even against their own self-interest, but just the objective situation is such. And that's what Oleg already said before. I think this is very important, but here is the point. If we want to be successful and to win in this confrontation, we cannot do it without changing ourselves. We cannot stay the way we used to be. We cannot continue domestically and socially and economically business as usual with the traditional neoliberal politics and policies. At the same time, trying to play a role of an alternative at the global level. That simply will not work. So in that sense, it's not only that Russia has to look with more attention on partisan forces like SYRIZA and Podemos, which will probably really need Russian support in the coming months already, not even years. But it will only work if we have some social transformation, social change within Russia itself. So here I stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris, for the very interesting presentation. I was looking at the faces of the audience here, the offline seminar, especially at younger ones, and I see that our Soviet tradition to be used to the Marxist terminology, to be used to the Marxist analysis of the proletariat and semi-proletariat was something new for some of our participants. So let's lumpen proletariat. So let's turn it back to our Soviet past in the Marxist theory as well. But this is, I think, that if we are going beyond traditional Marxism, and the left progressist parties in the European Union are going beyond the Marxism, beyond the proletarian idea, I think it would be exactly the point to give the floor to Ivan Ayala, who is the economic expert of the Podemos movement from Spain, for your presentation.
Okay, so thank you very much for your kind invitation. Thank you, Fyodor. Thank you, Ivan, Oleg, well, I have been able to be discussing during these few days with many colleagues. Boris, we have been previously talking very fruitful conversations, and I'm very proud to be able to speak about the Podemos proposal. So thank you very much for inviting us. Well, the first thing that I should be saying is that Podemos is the result of the indignation, and that is a fact that I'm gonna try to explain thanks to the how Podemos has emerged into the political context of Spain. I will give a brief presentation of how we have emerged, how is my vision about the reason or the justification of how we managed to have an opportunity to appear in the political arena of Spain. And secondly, I will try to give a glimpse of what is the economic proposal of Podemos, on which we are working right now. First of all, I think that I totally agree with many of the things that have been said in the table. We are assisting a collapse to the different neoliberalism that have been implemented in different regions of the world. To be more precise, the ordoliberalism that has been implemented in the European Union is collapsing. The European Union and the Eurozone, to be more concrete, is already collapsing. And I think that One of the things that should be stressed is that the change is already here. It does not depend on the Podemos will, but the change is already taking place. And the change is already taking place in the sense that the austerity measures that are being implemented in Spain and in the Eurozone, but mainly austerity measures have been embraced by the southern countries, are collapsing the entire Eurozone proposal. And the austerity needs a change, and this change is already being imposed. It's a change that is based on a low growth, high unemployment, low wages. It's a change that is also characterized by a dramatically decrease of the social services. So it's a change of the political consensus that emerged after the 1945, and that in Spain was crystallized in what we call the consensus of 1978. All these political consensus that allowed us to create what we call the welfare state is collapsing, and so the welfare state is also collapsing. So that change of consensus is what we are also challenging from Podemos. Let me remind you that in 2011 there was a demonstration of a few young people in La Puerta del Sol, in the center of Madrid. These people were demonstrating against the austerity measures that were being imposed by the socialist government in Spain. Well, the response of the authorities was to beaten up those demonstrators and to put them into jail and to try to put them very high fines. Well, the result was that the people gathered in a much broader, many more people gathered in the streets, many more people began to go to the Puerta del Sol, and many more people began to be organized in what we have been called the Indignados movement, or the 15M, the 15M. Well, this movement of the Puerta del Sol began to be created by general assemblies of thousands of people all around the country. It began in Madrid, but it began to spread afterwards in all the country. Well, you can imagine what can be the image of a big city like Madrid. The community has 5 million of inhabitants. The city has around between 2 and 3. Well, in the center of that town, having general assemblies of thousands of people trying to overcome the problems that they thought that they were facing, it was very challenging and very politically motivating. The Indignados movement had two main characteristics. First, it was an assembly movement, as I was saying, and it was a radically democratic movement in the sense that it was fundamentalist in all the decisions that were made and that were trying to be taken. And then the second characteristic is that it was an anti-party, anti-political party movement. It was not an anti-political movement, it was an anti-party movement. Okay? They denounced what we were calling the system of the political parties that existed, because we perceived that that system was not representing the interest of the general people, and the proof was that the people that were asking for a change were being beaten up and put into jail. So I think that Indignados movement was quite right. The system that emerged from 1978 couldn't or was being exhausted in that sense. So the Indignados movement achieved many things during its existence. Of course, it continued to exist, but the importance has decreased. The first thing that we achieved is to change the political discourse, to change the political agenda of the parties that we were criticizing. Okay? We put into the table subjects, political themes that weren't being discussed at that moment. The first is the lack of democracy of our system, in the sense that we didn't find the space to articulate new proposals, new economic and new political proposals that were very, very of the common sense, of what we call the common sense. Okay? And we put into the table the term of the subject of the corruption, of the rampant corruption that has driven Spain into the huge economic collapse that we are living. We put into the table the term of the debt with the audit, debt audit and restructuration. We put into the table the questioning of the consensus of 1978, the equilibrium that emerged in 1978 and that was crystallized in the current Spanish Constitution. By the way, regarding the Spanish Constitution, we were told that it was very difficult because we were asking for a change in the regime or in the system of voting, of elections, because we thought that it benefited too much the big parties and it didn't allow new political parties to emerge. And so we were told by the main political parties that changing the constitution was almost impossible because we had to have the consensus of 80% of the parliament, and that was impossible to achieve. Because that would need very harsh negotiations. The fact is that the Socialist Party changed the constitution in agreement with the Conservative Party from one day to another. But that change that was introduced was the change of one single article, the 135 article of the Constitution, of the Spanish Constitution, that and the change was for prioritizing the payments of the debts over any other expenditure in of the public sector. That meant that if there is a confrontation between paying the debt or paying the hospital, we have to close the hospital to pay the debt. Well, that huge change of the political consensus that represented the Spanish Constitution of 1978 was negotiated in one night during two main parties, and that is the real situation or the real will of those parties to promote the political change. Well, we managed, as I was saying, to put into the table many of the problems that we thought that were very important, and also an important thing, we challenged the system in some way. We weren't a movement that were promoting small changes here and there, or that were asking for an increase of wage only, or that were asking for were protesting against firing some workers of some. We were questioning the whole system, and that was a particular novelty in that sense. A mass movement, an assembly movement, a massive movement around Spain that was challenging or putting to the table the problematic of the whole system. And the second thing that we achieved, a very important thing, is to politicize the society, because before 2011, the political discourse and the political debate was mainly desert. We have to take into account that we had a socialist government that entered into power thanks to the opposition to the war of Iraq. And so the first term of that socialist government was characterized by increasing democratic freedoms or what we call fundamental freedoms, and the second term was characterized by the austerity measures. Okay? In the first term, it was very hard for the left. At the left of the Socialist Party to pass the discourse or to introduce new discourses. But in the second time, the questioning and the apparition of the Indignados movement allowed a politicization of the society, a politicization of the debate. The debates between the people began to be. I mean, the contents of the debate of the general people began to be very political, and that was very important for the for what happened next. Okay? So those are more or less what happened with the Indignados movement, what we managed to achieve and to create. Of course, many more things were achieved, like creating many other movements, parallel movements, peripheral movements to the Indignados process, very important in what has been the construction of Podemos. For example, we created the anti-eviction movement, which has stopped many eviction and which is one of the flags of Podemos. That, well, we will maybe have some time to talk about that movement because it's very interesting. But the fact is that we are achieved, or we arrived at a roof. We couldn't, we were able to denounce many of the things that we thought that were very, I mean, that were problematic, but we had many problems to propose. And even if we had the possibility or the imagination to propose alternatives, we couldn't put them into political action. And the tools that were being used by the movement to introduce into the legislative system some of our reivindications were systematically stopped by the government. For example, we proposed it is called Iniciativa Legislativa Popular, which is a popular initiative law or a project that has to gather many firms, around 1 million firms, and if they are gathered, you can propose them into the parliament, and the parliament has to discuss it, but that's it. And of course, they discuss it and they reject it. So we thought that the tools that were being offered to us for participating into the democratic system without creating a party were not being very active or very effective. And at the same time that this was happening, some guys were making a TV show. Some guys without any resource at all. Some guys in a garage. With a very austere TV show without any any money at all, but with very good discourses and with very good academics and with very good social activists. And that TV show began to be very well known among the Indignados movement. And that TV show appeared to be managed by some of the leaders that afterwards formed Podemos. Pablo Iglesias, Juan Carlos Monedero, Íñigo Errejón. Those people were creating or debating at the same time and participating, of course, of the Indignados movement. And that TV show began to be very well known. And those guys began to go to different TV shows. And at the same time that the No Resources TV show began to be known, those people were invited to other very well-known TV shows, and the discourse began to spread. And suddenly it appeared what they have called a window of opportunity, an opportunity to create a political movement that could put into practice some of the reivindications that were being discussed in the social movement, such as Indignados, previously, in the months before. And then Podemos was created at that time. Of course, many said that Podemos was a dream of 3 or 2 mad people, and the first election in which Podemos was presented, we obtained it was the European elections, the last European elections, and we had 5 deputies. Well, 5 deputies is not too much, isn't it? But it is too much, because it didn't exist 3 months before. And 3 months after, a political movement had the opportunity to be in the institutions of the European Union and to have a widespread to increase the possibility of arriving with the message to different people. Well, even though many said that those 5 MEPs were just the sign that Podemos was a bluff, that Podemos was a soufflé, was not a real alternative. Well, the second election that Podemos presented, it happened 2 weeks ago. It was the local and the federal elections. You know that in Spain, it is not a federal country, but it has strong characteristics, and we have 17 different provinces with 17 autonomous governments that have, those autonomous governments have many competencies such as justice, education, etc. Well, the thing is that in the local elections, we were not presented ourselves as Podemos, but we promoted a process of convergence in which social movements and political parties were being gathered around one proposition. Well, we won Madrid and we won Barcelona, which are the main cities in Spain. And this is very important because in Spain, when a political change has appeared, it has always begun in the big cities. The dynamics of the political change began always in the big cities, and this is the first sign of the change. Well, in the federal government, but its local and federal elections were held at the same time. We managed to be the third political force in Spain. This is a huge change in the Spanish political system because the traditional, the hegemonic political parties, the Socialist Party and the Conservative Party, used to have 80% of the total vote, while in the last elections they didn't manage to arrive at 50% of the vote. And that the change is being, we are witnessing the change. We are living the history right now. The thing is that the last elections were a picture in the middle of that change, but the change continues. And the next general elections are in November. And there we will see what is going to happen. Okay, so this is more or less how we arrived to be what we are right now. But at the same time, we have to, Podemos has been subjected to an amazing amount of attacks, mediatic attacks, political attacks, and different very dirty attacks. Of course, you would say that if you entered into politics, those are the characteristics of the political debate, but I don't think that that would be a very, I would not make that concession. I think that politics can be rather arguments and rationality, and I think that we are proposing in terms of economic terms, that is what I'm going to introduce right now. I think that we're proposing a very rational and a very technical proposal that is not only not challenging the European, the Eurozone, it is challenging the current order of the Eurozone, but is proposing a viable solution for the problems that I'm gonna try to describe very briefly of the Eurozone. Before, we were saying if Podemos is Marxist or not, or what is it? Well, what is really the case is that Podemos opens the door to implement a new political economy, a new policy, a new economic proposal, a new economic framework. And that framework has been worked in different heterodox school, or traditional school, such as Marxism, post-Keynesians, institutionalist. I mean, many academic traditions are being gathered in the proposal of Podemos. But what is very important is that Podemos really, right now, opens the door to apply other economic agenda. Well, Of course, we might say it is very more radical, less radical, it is very conservative, it is Keynesianist. Well, the fact is that the situation is so acute, the situation is so, the neoliberal attacks are so high that just a modest proposal, quoting Varoufakis, just a modest proposal of Keynesianism is right now very revolutionary in the Eurozone. That is the situation, that is the real situation, that is the attacks. The attacks of the neoliberal agenda are of a huge magnitude, and a little change represent a real opportunity. So, what are the main characteristics of our proposal? Well, the first of it is that we make a diagnosis of the economic situation of Spain based mainly in two important factors. The first is the high rate of unemployment that we have witnessing. Okay, the first thing that we must that strikes when we see the economic tableau of Spain is the rapid increase, the amazingly rapid increase of unemployment that we have witnessed. To give you an idea, from 2007, in 2007 we arrived at the lowest rate of unemployment of the Spanish democracy. We arrived to have 8% of unemployment, which was historically for us. The problem is that that low rate of unemployment was mainly sustained by the real estate bubble. And when the real estate bubble exploded, the creation of a huge mass of unemployed persons appeared. And there was no other sector that could absorb that huge increase of unemployment, because they have been destroyed by the same process of economic integration of the European Union. So the thing is that the unemployment from 2007, the lowest rate, to 2008 was an increase of 100% in just 1 year. And in 4 years, we arrived to have the highest rate of unemployment of the history of the Spanish democracy. So that is the problem, that what is signaling it's a problem of the productive system. As I was saying, the process of integration of Europe has created two different zones. Okay? If you see the industrial production index of the Eurozone, you can see very clearly that in the middle we've got the industrial production of the Eurozone, and at the right hand side, the greater, we've got those countries that are very industrial productive, such as Germany, Austria, or Denmark, and at the left hand side, those who have a lowest industrial production index, we've got Spain, Greece, Portugal, etc. And that is that is creating the continent. The process of integration has been divided between a center with financial and political power and a periphery with no political influence, high public debt, high unemployment, and no hope for recovery inside the Eurozone. And that creation of two different zones is driving the South Eurozone into a deeper crisis. Okay. I will just finish by saying that the second problem that we want to attack is the inequality problem, and of course a huge increase of unemployment is coupled with a huge increase in inequality. Spain has witnessed the highest increase in inequality after Greece in the whole Eurozone, and that is what we are going to tackle. We propose to eliminate completely the poverty. And just as a conclusion, what I was going to say is that we have modeled those sorts of proposals. We have a very theoretical grounds to say that those proposals can be made, that we can find the resources for making a new political, a new economic agenda, that new proposal is not just a proposal for a recovery in Spain, but a proposal for a recovery of the Eurozone, but that is challenging the current process of integration and the current the current principles that have impregnated the process of integration of the Eurozone. One phrase to finish. While the process of integration of the Eurozone has been characterized by the imposition of the interest of a few of the center, we propose to revert that process of integration from the interest of the people represented in the new government of SYRIZA, and I hope that Podemos in November. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan. Let's hope that your party will be successful at November elections.
Thank you.
And now I give the floor to Beatrice Clark, please.
Right, well, I'll be more brief. What I want to address here is the remark that was made earlier on in the session, that the main friends of Russia in the West today are Marxists. There are all sorts of paradoxes in this. If we look back some 25 years, we remember the period in which this new liberal Russia was being enthusiastically welcomed into the arms of Western capitalism. How far back that seems now. The isolation of Russia in the modern capitalist world is extreme. I just want to cite a particular example of this from my own country in Australia that relates to the G20 meeting that was held in the Australian city of Brisbane last year, and at which President Putin was to be present and which he was to speak. Australian Prime Minister Tony Abbott, in the lead-up to the G20, declared that he was going to shirt-front Putin at this meeting. And that was a remark which sent journalists and diplomats rushing for their dictionaries to try to work out what this term, to shirt-front, actually means. And what they found was it was a term from the game of rugby, which is extremely popular in Australia. And a shirt front means, in effect, to rush straight at somebody and to bowl them over. It's highly illegal in rugby. It'll get you sent off the field. It approximates to indictable assault. So here we had this promise from the Australian Prime Minister, with the Russian President coming to an Australian city to attend an international meeting, and the Australian Prime Minister was promising to physically assault him. Now, that's an example of the temper of the rhetoric that's been found in the West against Russia in recent times. It was particularly intense around the period of the reincorporation of Crimea into Russia. It hasn't really let up fundamentally ever since. It's been manifested in terms of actual foreign policy with the sanctions against Russia, attempts to undermine the Russian economy. So as we can see, things have changed and Russia is isolated in the international, in the world at large. The character of the mainstream press discourse on Russia is intensely unfavourable, very hostile. Now this relates, of course, to the Ukraine conflict, but there's much more than that, as I'll suggest later on. It reflects the overall position of Russia and of similar countries in relationship to the major centres of world capitalist power. And it's something with which Marxists, of course, ought to be grappling very closely, though in the event they're not always doing so. Given the intensity of the propaganda assault against Russia on the part of the mainstream press and of governments in the West, we find that the left has come under intense pressure to conform in this, not to oppose it, not to gainsay it. And this pressure to conform to the main capitalist discourse is coming into confluence with some long-term errors made by the left, right, from the Social Democrats through to some of the most extreme sects that we find in the Western left. Now, I won't say much about the social democratic parties in the West because, as we know, they've never essentially opposed the main thrust of Western capitalist policy. They weren't opposing fascism in Spain during the 1930s. These days, they're not really campaigning against fascist elements in Ukraine and the assault on the Donbass. On the genuine left, as I would put it, the actual anti-capitalist left, there's a situation of acute confusion. We have to remember that there are very few people in the Western left, properly speaking, who in any way are expert in Russian affairs. I was in Russia throughout the 1990s during the Yeltsin period, and there were only a handful of people like-minded from the West in Russia at that time, doing the work of reporting what was occurring and of trying to interpret it in Marxist terms. There are very few people in the Western left who speak Russian, have any familiarity with the writings that are coming out of Russia. Now, when we look at the activity of the Western left around the question of the Donbass, around the whole this whole situation, then we find that the picture isn't absolutely hostile, it isn't absolutely barren. There is a healthy strain of anti-fascism within this that's been manifested particularly in the British left. People are able to look at events in Ukraine and to say, well, here outright fascist elements have an important presence in the armed forces, constitute the most effective units in the Ukrainian armed forces, have a genuine influence on the Ukrainian government. And if we oppose fascism, and that's a strong tradition within the Western left, then these people are saying it's necessary to solidarize with the people in the Donbass who are fighting against it, and in a more guarded fashion, with the Russian government and with the aid which it's giving to that insurrection in the Donbass. That's a significant position within the British left, and the British Communist Party, for example, generally thinks along these terms. But that approach from the direction of anti-fascism has serious analytical limitations. It's not sufficiently sophisticated in Marxist terms. Unfortunately, a major current in the British left, in the British left particularly, but also in the United States, in the English-speaking world in general, thinks of the conflict in Ukraine in terms of a contest of two imperialisms. There's Western imperialism, the imperialism of NATO, the so-called imperialism of Russia, the traditionally imperialist power. And between these supposed two imperialisms, to which an equal sign is added, there's no choice that can be made, that can responsibly be made by Western leftists, by Marxists. And this propaganda is relatively shrill and effective within the Western left, among Western Marxists. And we have to remember that these are only relatively small forces that can consist of only a few thousand people in a country like Britain, even fewer in my own country, in Australia. The origins of this particular analysis can be traced back to the so-called state capitalist analyses of the Soviet Union. I've never been able to reconcile these analyses with Marxism. They seem to me particularly crude and primitive. The effect of this whole discourse, this so-called state two imperialisms analysis, derived initially from the state capitalist analysis, have the effect of reinforcing the conservative assault on Russia, which is paradoxical, considering this is coming from self-declared Marxists and members of the left. The effect is to draw away attention from the realities of NATO expansion. So the situation that you have among Western Marxists today is that the left is quite split on this question. The effect is that the left is largely ineffective and even irrelevant in the face of the anti-Russian hue and cry. It's a lamentable situation overall. Now, how do we respond to this? What are we trying to do in the West? There's a necessity for good, clear information on all these questions. Information about the nature of the Russian state and of the Ukrainian state. Information on events in the Donbass and circumstances surrounding them. This is being addressed by a relatively small group of comrades, particularly in Britain and in Canada, incidentally, because in Canada, of course, there is a large Ukrainian diaspora, and the anti-Russian hue and cry in Canada has been particularly intense. There have been people who have been affronted by this, angered by it, and have taken to the internet and are replying to it. There's a rather good website which has now been set up and which has been in production for some months now. I can give anyone who needs the details how to get hold of that. The other necessity, apart from providing good, clear, truthful information, is theoretical work by Marxists. It's necessary to clarify the relationship of Russia to the main centres of world capitalism, because that's the fundamental point which hasn't been understood until now within the Western left. There's a need for sociological and political analysis of Russia and Ukraine on a much higher level of sophistication than is found in the general Western mainstream discourse and the Western press, and also, for that matter, in a lot of left-wing papers. Now, what's being done in terms of this theoretical work to clarify the nature of this conflict and the status of Russia in relation to world capitalism? The website on its own isn't enough. This can address particular events and development, but it can't provide the underlying analysis that's essential. And the project in which Maurice and I are involved, and another contributor is Daniel Grigoriev, who's down there on the left, is a book which we're hoping will come out within, well, not too many more months, probably by a British publisher. And this is a book by left scholars from Russia, Ukraine, and the West. It combines chapters and analysis. It explores the reality of the US moves against Russia. It provides an analysis of the question of imperialism that goes far beyond the inanities of this one imperialism, another imperialism, the left stays out, that analysis. It looks at the various economic and military aspects of imperialism and shows that Russia cannot be considered an imperialist power in any meaningful sense. What we're setting out to do is also to provide a detailed historical analysis of the Maidan, of Crimea, of the Donbass conflict, and also of the motivations of Russian policy. Because it seems to us, our consensus is that Russian policy is essentially reactive to events outside and essentially defensive in its motivations. Now, when we finally get this book out, and we've been working on it for close on a year now, is it going to shift the thrust of Western left opinion and activism? Well, we don't know, but we're hopeful that it's going to be the most authoritative contribution by Marxists to this debate so far. And I think it will make a certain impact. It'll certainly anger a lot of Western leftists who've invested a great deal of their prestige in some very bad thinking. Can a few serious and principled left scholars make a difference? Well, we hope so. In any case, there's a need to turn the Western left back towards solidarity with the victims of global capitalism. And they've not shown themselves to be particularly good at this so far. Imperialism in our era is a compact of the developed against the semi-developed. Imperialism has changed since the time of Lenin in 1916 when he was writing about it. It's no longer primarily a conflict of one major imperialist power against another imperialist power. The imperialists have come to the conclusion that it's much more dangerous for them if they fight one another than if they unify themselves and address themselves to pressuring and exploiting the rest of the world. And BRICS countries are among the victims, and that's something which all Russians have to be conscious of, in my view. Russia is currently a target. The other BRICS countries are themselves likely targets in the future as the crisis of global capitalism develops. That's on the cards. Each of these countries has to anticipate it. The left has to return to showing solidarity with the victims of the system. And that's what Maurice and I and Daniel are involved in at the moment. Thank you.
And I should say that Ruslan Zarasov, who is present here, is also one of the authors of the same collection.
Okay, thank you, Renfrey. Thank you for your point about the Western left and its position towards Russia now. And we received a couple of questions from the internet. Unfortunately, we have only 30 minutes for discussions because these are the YouTube rules, no more than 2 hours. So now I raise the internet questions and I will ask the panelists to briefly answer them, and then we'll have some time for questions from the offline seminar, and then after the end of the 2 hours we will have the informal part with some rinfresco for offline participants to continue the discussion. So one of the questions was raised by Stephanie from the internet. Do you think that political ideology is important now when economy seems to be playing a bigger role in the international relations? Can we really speak of ideological renaissance or no? This is one question. Another question from Evgeny. From the economical point of view, what would be the key positions, the key points of left Marxism, and what would be the practical realization of these points? Then there was a question from Anastasia. What would be the perspectives for left forces in Latin America, especially in this region? And there are 2 other questions. I think they are mainly for Ivan, for Podemos, but also generally you can the other panelists can answer them. One is from John. Can you account for sustained success of Podemos or similar parties in the future? If yes, what grand changes do you see in the European political spectrum? And there are also the last question from Ivan. Why it is exactly now the protest movements are transforming into real political parties? So this is the web part of the questions. And
also there was a question about practical.
So Boris, please.
Okay, let's go very fast because we don't have so much time. But let's go fast because we don't have so much time. But first of all, I think that speaking about their the move from the movements to parties. I think the movements were there since Seattle, since 1999, and there was always a debate, and there were all sorts of reasons why some of these movements were reluctant to become parties, and I think for a good reasons, because they were not martyr. So the maturing of the movements, the growth, their capacity of addressing certain issues is at some point necessarily puts them in front of a question where they can become political forces. Because as Ivan already said, there are limits. There are limits of what you can achieve as long as you are not political. Once you become political, then at some point you have to become a party, whether you call it a party or whether you call it something else, but you'll become a political actor, in one way or another. So, and I think, speaking about ideology, well, economy is always essential. As long as we have capitalism, economy is always essential, but economy actually is reflected in ideology. Economy is being put in practice through ideology. Ideology is very interconnected with economy. The important thing is what is behind ideology, because ideology can express certain interests, but it can also hide certain interests. So it is very important to go to the critical method of early Karl Marx, to go beyond ideologies, to deconstruct ideologies and see what's behind ideologies. And then you see economy is behind, but what kind of economy? What kind of interests? And the important thing is what about the practicalities? Because Ivan already pointed to that, and he was kind of stopped at the very moment when he was starting to go into details. The most inciting point, and that's where he ran out of time. And I don't know what's the proposal of Podemos more concretely, though in general, of course, yes, all these forces are trying to implement more Keynesian, more social and welfare measures. They are more interested in generating demand in the economy through increasing wages and making labor rights kind of more guaranteed. So creating better conditions for labor. But also, I think what is more general for the upcoming left-wing movements is that they're all interested in trying to turn the public sector into a locomotive of development of the post-crisis, post-globalization world. But here is the question, what makes public sector be really public? This is a big question, especially here in Russia with our so-called state corporations, which I do not really see as public sector companies. They're more like private companies owned by the state, to be honest. And so it also needs a lot of restructuring of what we call public sector state enterprise. The importance of restructuring of the public and state sector is part of that. And of course, there is the need for social investment, cultural investment, educational investment, and so on. So science, education, health, it must be expanded rather than cut. So we have to go exactly the opposite compared to the austerity programs which are cutting healthcare, education, and so on. But again, restructuring is absolutely necessary. Without restructuring, all these investments will become ineffective, inefficient. That's true. But it doesn't mean that we don't have to make them. It means that we have to make them through restructuring specific institutions through which these investments are made. And of course, then you need all sorts of public and social needs to be addressed directly, to be recognized and be addressed directly. Not necessarily only through the state, but also through communities, through all sorts of new institutions to be developed in the process. So I think it's a very general description of what this kind of post and anti-crisis left agenda is proposing. And then, of course, in every specific country have a very specific range of issues, because it's also about specific questions which you have to answer immediately, like in Greece with the question of debt and so on and so on. Okay, I think Ivan will say more. Huh?
Yes, please. Take the mic.
Okay. Sorry. Well, I've got two now.
That's even better. Even better.
Okay. Very, very quickly, I just like to say 2 or 3 things about what the different questions that have been posed. The first of all, I would like to say concerning what Stephanie was saying regarding political ideology and if it is important when economy seems to be playing a more important role. Well, I would like to say that the current status of the economics profession, the scientific status of the economic science, it's right now and at the moment very low because it is only serving to a political agenda. The scientific status of the economy, it's only supporting one tiny part of the economic science, which is the neoclassical, from which is derived the neoliberal agenda. And so, just to say that right now, the mainstream economics is only being driven by political interest. And so that is why a more pluralistic approach, what is being demanded within the economic profession, to widen the spectrum of the school of thoughts that we have been hearing in the table, would not only increase the possibilities of economics, but would increase the scientific status of the economic profession. Secondly, concerning the political, why now the movements have been converted into politics in some countries. I would like to clarify that the social movements must exist, are autonomous, and that they continue to live independently of the political parties. And they have to be so, and the political parties have to be enough generous to reckon the autonomy of the social movements, and the autonomy of the social movements. So it is not because some of the people that were working in the social movements have formed or are participating right now in the political parties that the social movement have been transformed into a political party, but that the transfers, that the channels of transfer between social and political have been widened. But in any case, social movements are always necessary, and of course they have not to be, or in my mind, they have not to be completely converted into political instruments. They are different tools. And to finish. John was asking about the sustained success of these parties in the future. Well, it would will depend on on what is happening right now in Greece, mainly, and in Spain, and what happened in Greece in the negotiation, and how this very irresponsible way from the Troika to negotiate and to trying to impose stupid and nonsense economic proposals into a country like Greece, depending on the results of that negotiation, well, the situation in Greece could go from one way to another, and that could influence in somewhat other political parties. In any case, I think that, as I was saying in the beginning, the change is already there. What we are discussing is the direction of the change. And I think that what has been witnessed in Spain is that we have seen a radical change of the electoral vote towards a toward leftist proposals, and that is, well, that allows us to forecast a sustained success, as John was putting. Thank you.
Also, Latin America was mentioned.
Yeah.
Can you say a few words on Latin America?
Well, the thing is that, well, in Latin America, the change has already happened, and it is true that Latin America has passed for what is passing right now, the Eurozone, from the austerity policies, the structural policies, and those attacks on the condition of living of the Latin Americans created the breeding ground for new political parties and new social movements, such as the one in Ecuador, Venezuela, and different countries. And of course, those countries have different problematics, as Boris said, but I think that the same dynamic is happening right now in the Eurozone, in the sense that the political neoliberal agenda, the austerity measures, are are collapsing the Eurozone and are helping to emerge those new leftist proposals. So I think that the dynamics, of course, very differently are replicated in some sense, in the sense that the opportunity has emerged because of the huge amount of attacks that are receiving. Thank you.
Renfrey? No? Okay. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we still have 18 minutes, so your questions, your points. Yes, Marina, please. Just introduce for the web audience.
Marina Raskanyal, I'm a journalist from magazine Однако and Moscow Economic Forum. Maybe you know, we are strongly against neoliberalism. My question is to Boris, I think. That's clear that neoliberalism is absolutely logical development or the consequence of capitalism itself. And history has shown that the only way to change the system radically was totally another system. That was socialism. But when it's so, it seems that all these practices, measures, or policies that we can use now, taken from socialist experience, can only slightly limit or soften neoliberal principle in particular fields, and not more. So it's not the solution. Yeah, let's be honest. So my question is very simple. If not socialism, then what can be a real alternative to neoliberalism?
Okay.
Yeah, fundamental question. I know.
Okay. Let's collect several questions. Yeah, Mr. Kolarov, yeah.
My question is to our Spanish guest. Do you think that is existing the danger to finish the left revolution, the peaceful left revolution in Latin America after the president's term of Cristina Fernández de Kirchner and after one very possible impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, which will be which be in that same time one American invasion to Venezuela after the charges to Diosdado Cabello that he is participating in the narco traffic, that he's head of narco cartel in Venezuela. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Very need to present myself, yes. My name is Evgenia Drozhechko. I'm a representative of Moscow State University. So my question will be addressed to two people, Ms. Yurievich and Mr. Rayal. So my first question is, I was actually interested by the term about which you spoke so passionately. It was post-globalism. So my question is, shall we understand this term from the point of social and political view rather than economic one? Because it seems that not so much has changed from the time when IMF gave such a definition to globalization. Globalization it is, yeah. That it is the growing interdependence of economies, which is accompanied with the exchange of goods and services and the streams of capital and diffusion of technologies. So do you take this very part of definition into account when you speak about post-globalization? I'm sorry if I called it somehow different at the beginning of my speech. And second question was to Mr. Ayal. It was the first is statement. The proverb says that tastes differ. My statement is states differ. And the question is, do you think that the roots of economic problems differ in these states? And is there a guarantee that the solution of making left-wing parties come to rule and come to power will be the absolutely and totally working solution for all of the countries which are suffering from economic crisis? Thank you.
Okay. Okay, and the last question from the judge.
Thank you. My name is Ruslan Zarasov. I'm from the Plekhanov Economic University. I have a question to Renfrey Clark. Could you tell us what is the contribution of the Russian left to these debates among the Western leftists on Ukrainian crisis?
Okay, please, Boris.
Okay, let me start. We have not so much time. So I will answer Marina's question last. So starting with post-globalization, you see the point is that it's a description of a tendency or an era which is just in its beginning. The point is that we just want to differ with deglobalization argument of Walton Bellow, but in probably more in terms than in substance, because, for example, I'm 100% sure that no matter what happens, there will be more protectionism rather than more free markets. It'll happen. No matter what kind of governments there will be in power, no matter who is going to run these or that countries. The only difference is in whose interests will this protectionism be implemented. That's the only issue, and that's exactly what the struggle is about. Because, of course, there will be more domestic markets as the kind of center of development. But again, what kind of markets? How are they going to be shaped? By which particular measures and institutions? This is an absolutely open question. And by the way, what we see now is very often the kind of protectionism which dresses itself as if it is a free market economy. Much of the WTO policies are radical protectionist policies by the West against non-Western countries, in fact. We have to defend this right for social protectionism, which will change the situation, because this kind of protectionism of the rich against the poor doesn't work. That's the problem. It's not creating strong domestic markets, for example. And in that sense, another point is that the era of globalization was the era of financialization. So the important thing here is to enter the era of definancialization of capital into the era of new productivism. It's new welfare state, but it's also new productivism. But again, it cannot go forward without enormous level, not just of state intervention, but also state investment, including controlling financial flows and so on. And again, I can recommend my book, which is both in English and in Russian, From Empires to Imperialism, which actually deals with this question historically, starting with the 17th century. And then, well, of course, Renfrey will ask about the Russian left better than I can from the outside. But addressing what Marina said, there is a danger that the new left governments will be like the previous social democratic governments, which means that they will end up doing almost nothing or trying and failing and then doing nothing again. However, I think it's not necessarily going to be so, and more, I think it will not be so. Why? Also because they represent a new phase and new situation in the global political and social development, and they represent new forces which are coming, which are growing, and which are trying to understand and find themselves in the process of this political struggle. And again, an important question here is whether these forces are going to be strong enough to consolidate an alternative. Here the question is answered very simply. I think the answer is in BRICS. If we have at least one country in the BRICS which is moving towards a more kind of more democratic, more social agenda, then that changes the balance of force, so that creates an area of opportunities for other smaller countries and for other movements in these countries to become more radical and more successful. That's why I'm very enthusiastic about the attack of the West on Russia. Not because I have any illusions about our own elites, on the contrary. To be honest, I have a very negative opinion of our own elites. But at the same time, I think that they are pushed into a particular corner. And in that sense, I think we have to thank Western politicians for attacking Russia, because that creates an opportunity for change in our country. And I think they will actually be very upset about what they have done when it really happens. Thank you.
Ivan.
Okay. Well, regarding Latin America, I have really no capacity to say what is going to happen. It is very far away from Spain. I'm very specialized on that, and macroeconomist. In any case, I think that I will stick to what I said before. The thing is that the condition that created the opportunity for those governments to emerge were the conditions of the 80s and of the 90s of the structural programs. So the huge amount of inequalities and of poverty that those programs created, well, they created some conditions that haven't disappeared yet. So I don't know if those processes are going to stop or how they're going to evolve. But I think that the conditions that allowed them to appear remain there. And regarding the question about it is true. I totally agree that the roots. I mean, each state have a particular case. It's a particular case, and the roots of the crisis, of course, are different in each. Or the crystallization of the crisis in different countries is, of course, different and depends on the economic structure of each country, which is completely different from Spain than from Germany, for example, and thus the political dynamics that emerge because of the economic conflicts or economic problems diverge in Europe. So I don't think, of course, that the same solution could be for everyone, but I think that the same principles could be shared in the Eurozone for a new process of integration. And I think that the very similar models can be applied to the southern countries, the southern periphery, such as SYRIZA or Podemos or Portugal or Italy, and even France, who would not want to be called periphery. Indeed, it is not a peripheral country, it is a central country, but it can play a role of pivotal between the center and the peripheral country, a role of mediator, a role of equilibrator, and that is very important. What happens in France? That is why the new political dynamics of France are very important.
Yeah,
right. Now, Ruslan asks what the contribution of the Russian left is to debates within the Western left on current questions. It can't really be said that positions of the Russian left have had a great resonance within the Western left simply because they're only beginning now to be put out. The crucial thing that the Russian left can explain to Marxists in the left is the nature of Russian capitalism, because you live within it. We merely observe it from outside, and often very indirectly and indistinctly. One of the most important contributions which has been made so far to this debate, and which is starting to penetrate into the left, has been made by Ruslan himself in his book, The Conundrum of Russian Capitalism. It's an extremely valuable text because it shows the relationship between the present-day oligarchic capitalism in Russia and the structures of the Soviet economy, the way in which the structures of Soviet powers, the structures of Soviet economic production were carried over into the post-Soviet period and transmuted, but not transmuted into healthy capitalist corporations in any real sense, but into some kind of monsters. It's very much worth reading, and I'm very hopeful that this will eventually attain a much broader readership within the Western left. And on top of that, it's necessary for Russian leftists to address the task of explaining what the history of Russian foreign policy is and how this differs from the history of the NATO powers, why the motivations of Russian policy are different. There are consistent attempts within the left to equate what NATO has been doing, the expansion of NATO into Eastern Europe, with a counter-move from on the part of the Russian government, attempting to recreate a form of Soviet Union. This is simply inane, and it's up to the Russian left to explain why this is the case. And of course this ties in with all the questions of the economic nature of Russia and the character of imperialism, why Russia is not an imperialist state, why it's not remotely on the level of development of the major Western powers. Why Russia has an economy which is essentially in the category of the BRICS powers, that is, of semi-developed countries which don't have highly developed finance capitals, which aren't major exporters of capital, and which consequently aren't marked by this compulsion to try to export capital and to control their peripheries, to control the international markets for their products, in short, to behave in the fashion of the United States. The character of Russian capitalism so far is completely different, and it's up to the Russian left to explore these questions, to detail them, and to put their findings in front of Marxists in the West. It's also up to the Russian left to explain the paradoxes of what's happening in the Donbass, in Novorossiya, as it's termed. Why was it the case that many of the original leaders of the Donbass revolts were Russian citizens? What was going on there? Why was there such media pressure? Why was there such a degree of intense propaganda surrounding the Donbass revolt from the Russian side? How did this reflect Russian foreign policy? This is something which Marxists and the left found intensely confusing. There was a readiness to equate the degree of propaganda on the part of the Russian popular press with the intensity of the propaganda found in the West. So questions such as this, there's a great deal of work to be done. There are really rather few Western publishers prepared to tackle this question, even though there is a curiosity among Western leftists. And there are, of course, all the problems of Western scholars who are prepared to address these questions in the necessary way. The problem of getting texts translated for an unpopular position, a position which isn't extensively shared even within the left within Russia. So it's an enormous challenge for the Russian left. They need to explain these questions and to put their conclusions in front of Western progressives.
Okay, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your interest to our conference now and to the Valdai program on global alternatives. We will follow our research work exactly in this month with the publication of the second Valdai paper within the framework of our program. It will be the paper on social commons, the notion of social commons versus the neoliberalism. It will be prepared by Francine Mestrum from Belgium. Another papers will follow during July and August, and we are also open to any your proposals, any your topics for research. Let me thank all panelists and thank our host, Mr. Timofeyev and Russian International Discussion Club.